Hello and welcome back to the Stronger Than Steel podcast. My name is John Keir, and today I'll be doing a solo episode talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers news and their offensive tackles looking ahead to the NFL draft. It is season 2, episode 4. This will be broken up into several parts. Part 1, like I just said, we'll be talking about the tackles, and looking forward, we'll also be talking about the interior linemen. Austin and I decided that with the NFL draft fast approaching, it is now April 7th at 12:59 a.m. at the time of this recording that we are going to have to bunch up some positions if we want to get to the important positions before we get to the NFL draft. So that is why we're doing this. I figured I'd take the offensive lineman since it seemed like the offensive line was probably one of the positions that the Steelers had the lowest need going into the draft. So before we jump into that, I just wanted to look at some of the rule changes that were recently approved by the NFL at the owners' meetings in Arizona a few weeks ago. So, first thing we're looking at is the new replay challenge rule changes. So, that involves now a centralized reviewing process will be taking place, I believe, I don't know where, I think it's in New York, similar to what the NHL and MLB already do for their replays, where they have a standard set location take all the instant replay reviews. Something that I think is going to be beneficial for the league going forward. I I don't hate what the officials have to do now, but I think it's just better to have a neutral agent kind of making the decisions when it comes to what the call in the field should be. And I feel like it's going to improve the time that these replays take. So it won't mean that perfect calls are going to be made on all the time, but at the same point, I feel like it's going to help the efficiency and the calls are going to be a little bit better. So I think that was a good decision by the NFL. The other one I don't like at all, and that's the overtime rule change. So now overtime lasts 10 minutes. The only thing that's different is that it's 5 minutes less, and I really don't understand the point of it. This rule change affects something like 2% of all football games since 2010. The NFL made a good step in the right direction, in my opinion, in 2011 and 12 when they went from sudden death to there's a chance that both teams will have the ball in overtime. But there's still room for improvement. I mean, look at the first Super Bowl ended in overtime this past season, and the Patriots had the only drive. There was no second drive. The Falcons never had a chance. Now, granted, they may not have deserved it the way they blew that lead, but the point persists. They should have had another chance to score. I really do like college football's overtime rules, although I don't think the NFL should adopt that ex- exactly to the letter, exactly what they're doing. Maybe start from their own 25, but I like the idea of both teams having a chance to score, and I can understand why owners wouldn't like that, however, given the fact that the overtimes can last longer. So I can't appreciate it, but I do think that there's some sort of happy middle ground somewhere there. I don't like the idea of changing the overtime rules because yes, this doesn't affect a lot of games, but now you're looking at the possibility of more ties in the NFL, and that's really something I don't think a lot of fans were wanting. They really were thinking, man, we really needed more ties this year. So that's something I really don't get by the NFL, but it is what it is, and we'll see how it goes, how it looks going forward. So moving to some NFL or Steelers news from NFL news. Uh, Nothing new on the Martavis Bryant suspension situation. We had expected that Bryant was going to be reinstated by this point. However, it seems like a decision has not been made yet, and even though it appears to be imminent, which is good news for the Steelers, we haven't heard anything specifically from Roger Goodell. So maybe that is a little concerning, but at the same point, it's still a long off season. I don't think it's time to get worried just yet. So moving on, Mike Tomlin says the Steelers are proceeding with the mindset that Ben Roethlisberger should will be playing this upcoming season. You know what? That's as they should. The signing of Landry Jones proves to me that this has been the Steelers' mindset all along. The talk of retirement has been a good reminder that the Steelers should start planning for the future soon, but for the time being, they still have their franchise quarterback. There's no need to make an immediate decision at the position. Even though they have been bringing in quarterbacks for pre draft visits, there's been a theme going online about what people think that's all about. I tend to agree that it's probably something about evaluating quarterbacks in the draft because they don't want to have to go in right when they're drafting the guy that's going to be Roethlisberger's replacement and have no idea how to evaluate quarterbacks. I mean, they know how to evaluate them, but I think it's going to be a good idea for them to go in there and try to figure out how they want to look at quarterbacks going forward. So this will give them a good test run before they actually do the real thing next year or the year after. And then as of today, Chris Hubbard signed his tender, so he is back on the team this year. He's set to make $1.8 million this season. Personally, I liked Hubbard a lot this past season. He began the year as kind of a fringe player who only made the team because of his versatility. And then he became someone that was kind of important to the team. He was on the field in almost all jumbo package situations. He was a pretty good run blocker, and he could fill in anywhere pretty admirably as the season went on. I'm pretty comfortable with him being one of the first linemen off the bench, and I know that he can play either guard or tackle well, and in a pinch can play center as well, but they also have BJ Finney, so it's unlikely he'll play that position. So all in all, I like the signing. It's a good depth move, and I think the offensive line is still the Steelers' deepest position going forward. So looking at two of those positions, or I guess one if you want to group them together, but we're taking a look at the offensive tackles. We got two starters here that we're looking at. We got Marcus Gilbert, who's probably the most underrated right tackle in all of football. Someone that went from an overweight and slow player when he was first drafted to someone that's become kind of a muscular and technically sound player. Gilbert was probably the biggest Pro Bowl snub on the team last season. A reliable run blocker and a great pass protector on the right side. I think Gilbert might be the best tackle the Steelers have had on their roster in a pretty long time. He's one of the more proficient tackles I've seen on the Steelers since I started watching them. On the other side, you have Alejandro Villanueva, the former Army Ranger. He's made significant strides over the last few seasons, going from a practice squad player to a backup to all of a sudden a starter, and now he's a pretty good starter. It looks like he may have regressed to his early 2015 form at the beginning of this season, but now with one full season under his belt, it looked like Villanueva put together a pretty solid 2016 season. He's not going to blow anyone away with his talent and athleticism, but he has the heart and the will to compete that I could say is probably stronger than anybody he's going to face. He probably still has room to improve in both the run and pass game as well, which is pretty encouraging to hear. Outside of him, the first backup we're anticipating is going to be Gerald Hawkins, the former fourth-round pick last season that didn't play due to injury. With the retirement of one Ryan Harris, Hawkins looks to be in good position to grow in his second season to become the swing tackle off the bench. The knock on him was that he wasn't very technically sound at the time, and now that he's had a year to sort of develop himself, he could probably eventually become a starter under the right tutelage, or at least be in the mold to become a starter. The Steelers have that and offensive line coach Mike Munchak, so I'm feeling pretty confident that Hawkins could be coached up well by someone like Mike Munchak, a Hall of Famer in his own right. So there's reason to suspect that he's going to be an improved player this season. And Hawkins can play both tackle positions. That's also worth noting. Outside of him, the only other tackle with significant NFL experience is Brian Mahalik, who was inactive for most of last season. He's a versatile lineman, but he's probably not someone you really want to see on the field that often. And before I move on, I just want to say that Chris Hubbard can play both tackle positions, but we're going to group him with the interior lineman for this episode. So moving on to losses at the position, Ryan Harris, who he announced his retirement in March, and I was just wondering if this was really an impactful loss. I'm going to say it wasn't. Harris was injured for most of last season and wasn't a lock to make the roster this year either. His departure means the Steelers may potentially look into the draft or free agency for one more guy to sort of bolster the position, but at the top, the Steelers absolutely don't need another tackle. Even if Harris chose to play, like I said, he may not have made the roster in favor of Gerald Hawkins. And honestly, when Harris announced his retirement, I completely had forgotten that he was on the Steelers. Not that he's a bad player or anything, but he had been injured for so long and he hadn't played for much at all that I almost forgot that he had been on the team. So maybe you're a little disappointed that the Steelers lost a little depth, but I really don't think it's that important because the Steelers were without him and they did just fine with what they had anyways. So looking at the free agency and draft need for this position, I think the free agency need is honestly pretty non existent. The Steelers have their starters in place and have two capable backups in Hubbard and Hawkins who can play both tackle positions if they need to. In the draft, I think it's also probably a late round pick if they pick one at all. I'd say no earlier than round 5 or 6. They have no need for a guy who can step in and be the starter from day one. They have their project players, so really, if you're looking at anybody, you'd just be drafting them to be the number like 3 or 4 tackle, and there's no point in wasting a draft pick on that, and you can probably find an undrafted free agent for that. So, that being the case, this really isn't a position that the Steelers need to invest in. But should they decide to, I decided to take a look at 3 tackle prospects that the Steelers could be interested in. First, I started, as I typically do, with the University of Pittsburgh product, Adam Bisnowaty, who standing at 6'6" and 304 pounds, a 4-year starter at the University of Pittsburgh. Bisnowaty was a mainstay on the Panthers' strong offensive line, particularly the last 2 seasons. He played 4 years at left tackle, but is likely to be a right tackle in the NFL. So, looking at his strengths, Bisnowaty fits the mold of an NFL tackle. He's tall and he's strong, and he's a fundamentally sound run blocker at the point of attack, and he has an aggressive finish to his blocks. He can go toe-to-toe with just about anybody in the league. He's strong, and he plays well against the physical pass rushers. He shows a good initial technique with a good first step in pass protection. Some of his weaknesses include the fact that he's missed games in each of his first 3 seasons in college football, and it appeared to take a toll last season. Scouts reported that Bisnowaty's athleticism seemed to decline somewhat in his senior season, as he struggled with consistent blocking at the second level and had trouble with speed rushers on the outside. It seemed as though he was too slow this season to combat good speed rushers, and that's something he's definitely going to struggle with at the NFL level right now. So, bottom line, Bisnowaty has the strength, toughness, and attitude that's needed for an NFL tackle, but concerns about his athleticism and injury history could cause him to drop. He's definitely a developmental project and most likely a right tackle, and could, with some work, become a reliable starter if he manages to stay healthy. Most mock drafts I've seen have him going between rounds 4 and 6. Moving on to the second prospect, we have the big man, Dan Skipper, standing at 6'10" and 309 pounds from the University of Arkansas. A towering figure, Skipper has started every game since the middle of his freshman season at Arkansas. He started 8 at guard that season, and since 2014, he started the rest at left tackle. A first-team All-SEC selection this season, Skipper also has a Razorbacks record with 3 blocked field goals due to his height. So looking at some of his strengths, he has a good opening step in run blocking. He has the ability to pull and move well in space, something that's seen as somewhat uncommon amongst tackles in that position, especially if you consider his size. Also, size. He has experience in a pro-style offense and should be able to understand the NFL blocking schemes right away. He's a responsible pass blocker who knows who to block when there are twists and stunts on the offensive line. On the defensive line. Some weaknesses, though, he struggles to get low because of his size and will be pushed around by bull rushers due to his poor technique in that regard. His footwork does leave a lot to be desired after the initial step, and especially when you consider his size, he doesn't have the power that you would want someone to have when they're that big. He also doesn't finish his blocks or hold them as long as scouts would like. He doesn't have enough lower body strength to get the job done at this point. So bottom line, his size is going to be interesting to some teams, but Skipper lacks the power that you want in someone that's 6'10". He needs some work on his technique, but his knowledge of the pro-style offense and experience at Arkansas will likely get him drafted in the later rounds, and he'll have a slim chance of making an NFL roster this season as a swing tackle. Moving on to our last prospect, we have Julian Davenport from Bucknell University at 6'7" and 318 pounds. Davenport was an all-conference pick in every year that he played college ball and started every game at left tackle. He has the chance to be the 8th offensive lineman selected in the first 100 picks in NFL history later this month. Looking at some of his strengths, he has great upper body strength and size. He has the ability to make his hands stick to the pass rusher so they do not get free when they're rushing the quarterback. He has good enough athleticism to get to the second level and can get out into space too. He has a great first step, particularly in pass protection, and has a good time blocking speed rushers. He possesses great leadership qualities as a former captain for 2 years at Bucknell and has a good physical frame. Looking at his weaknesses, due to the fact that Bucknell is in Division II, Davenport is unlikely to be ready for the NFL pass rushers when he steps in. He does struggle with footwork and pass protection and can be easily knocked off balance. He tends to lean into his blocks both in the running and passing game rather than running in with his feet. He has an uneven pad level that will let the blocks roll off of him in the running game due to his poor footwork. So, overall, Davenport has fantastic physical traits and leadership qualities that will be appealing to some NFL teams, but his poor technique and poor competition in college football will mean that Davenport's likely a project player who could be eventually forced to move to the right side of the offensive line, and he does have a high upside. Most mock drafts I've seen have him going between rounds 5 and 7. So, to wrap up here for now, you have the three guys, Adam Bisnowaty, Dan Skipper, and Julian Davenport. If I had to rank them personally on how good I think they are and who I think I'd like to see the Steelers draft first to last, I think the Steelers would like to see their guy Adam Bisnowaty, a former University of Pittsburgh product, someone that they've probably seen play before. I just think that Bisnowaty is somebody that the Steelers would be most comfortable drafting with a position that they don't really need to draft in this year. Next, I have Julian Davenport. Just because of his potential upside, I think there's a lot to like if the Steelers pick him, even though he won't be contributing on day one. And then next, I have, last but not least, Dan Skipper. Look, you got to love his size, but for someone as big as he is, he doesn't play as strong as you'd hope. And at the same time, he also doesn't have quite the athleticism that you're looking for. So, I'm sorry, not the athleticism, the technique. He doesn't have quite the technique that you're hoping for someone at that position at this stage. So, for that reason, I have to have him last. So, last thing before we wrap up part 1 here, tackle depth chart for next season. I got my starters, Villanueva and Gilbert on the outsides, backed up first by... my apologies. I have Chris Hubbard here as the first backup. I neglected to mention Gerald Hawkins. He's going to be my number 1 backup, followed by Chris Hubbard as the second man, the all kind of utility offensive lineman, followed by Brian Mahalik, who's going to be the last offensive lineman on the roster. So, thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back for part 2 later. Probably won't be doing it in this studio. I neglected to mention that because Austin is not doing this with me today, and because I am at my school's radio station, I decided to broadcast from one of our newsrooms here. So maybe if it sounds different here, that's why. Soundproof room, something I don't have the luxury of as a college student in my own home. So I figured I'd give it a shot here and see what it's like. So hopefully my listeners will like what they listen to for part 1. Part 2 we'll have back at my place most likely later this week for the interior offensive lineman. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Kier. If you want to follow us on Twitter at Stronger_Steel and check us out on Facebook at Stronger Than Steel Podcast. So check us out and we'll post our episodes there. And we'll also post them on YouTube and Facebook. Don't forget to email us if you have any questions about the show. StrongerThanSteelPodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining me today, and good night, everybody. Alrighty, we are back, and I'm going to be taking a look at the Pittsburgh Steelers interior offensive linemen. So, we're going to start first with the guards. You have David DeCastro, Ramon Foster, and Chris Hubbard on the roster. And for the centers, you have Marquise Pouncey and backup Mike Matthews at this time currently under contract. So what do the Steelers have at these positions right now? So in my opinion, the Steelers are pretty much set at both their guard and center positions when it comes to their starters. They have one of the best centers in the league in Marquise Pouncey, a 5-time Pro Bowler, leading the entire line. When healthy, he has only one discernible weakness, and that comes against the biggest and strongest defensive lineman in the league, like Brandon Williams of the Baltimore Ravens. Otherwise, he's going to win most of the one-on-one matchups, and he's incredibly athletic, something that allows him to pull out wide, which is something that you don't really see that centers do very often. Next to him, you have David DeCastro, who made the Pro Bowl for the second year in a row. One of the smartest linemen in the league, and in addition to being one of the best at his position when it comes to pulling. DeCastro is an excellent guard as well. Ramon Foster on the other side might be the most underrated Steelers players of the past few seasons. Someone who was an undrafted free agent in 2009, made the roster, and has since become a reliable starter over the last few years with no real glaring weakness, in addition to being a vocal leader on the line and one of the player reps for the NFL Players Association. Behind him, you have Chris Hubbard, who's the only other NFL player with experience on the roster. I discussed his ability and versatility earlier when we were looking at the tackles. So, looking at some key free agents in this position group, you have B.J. Finney, who's an exclusive rights free agent, Cody Wallace, who is an unrestricted free agent, and Cole Manhart and Valerian Ume Izioki, I believe is how you say it. So, looking at them, you have B.J. Finney, who we're going to start. He was a standout as a replacement guard, filling in for injury this year for, I believe it was Foster who was injured, but DeCastro may have missed a game too. He looked like someone who has the potential to become a starter on the line within a year or two, if you ask me. And because he's an exclusive rights free agent, the Steelers should have no problem signing him at some point this offseason. He is an important part of the line and should be the first man off the bench for either guard or center. The man who once held that role was Cody Wallace, who most recently had that role, but injuries cost him the entire 2016 season and is likely on his way out, as the cheaper and younger Finney will most likely be his replacement. So now looking ahead to the free agency and draft need at these two positions, the Steelers have practically no need to draft here. They have their starters in place, and they have one backup under contract with exclusive rights to another. Re-signing B.J. Finney should be the only thing the Steelers need to do on the offensive line for the remainder of the offseason. If they do draft a guard or center, I imagine it would be a late round 6 or 7, but they really have no need to. So we'll move right along to interior prospects. I only took a look at two of them because, as I said before, I really don't believe it's something the Steelers need to look at. So starting first, we're going to be looking at center John Toth from the University of Kentucky. Standing at 6'5" and 307 pounds, Toth was a reliable starter at the University of Kentucky. He started every game in his college career, minus the first of his freshman year, which he also played in an all-freshman selection in 2013, and made the All-SEC this past season, which, if you know anything about that conference, it's routinely regarded as the best in the country. So being able to make first All-Team SEC is pretty impressive. So let's look at some of his strengths here. Obviously, when you start 48 out of a possible 49 games in your college career, you're going to be a pretty experienced player, and that's something that Toth is coming to the NFL with. And it's also coming against many quality NFL-ready players in the SEC. I watched some of his tape against the Alabama Crimson Tide from this season, a team that is usually regarded as an NFL machine when it comes to churning up products and NFL-ready players from that school, especially considering how much better Alabama is than the Kentucky Wildcats, Kentucky routinely being among the bottom of the SEC standings, and Alabama making the last 2 national championships. Toth seemed like he held his own in that game. He was a pretty steady pass blocker, rarely getting beaten or caught out of position while protecting the quarterback. He uses his hands pretty well and has a good strong punch to begin his pass protection, and has a good anchor to slow down bull rushers. Weaknesses, however, Toth seemed pretty slow when it came to run blocking and moving along the line. His athleticism really lacks, and he tends to be stiff, which compounds the problem of being slow. He has difficulties reaching the second level of the defense, especially on running plays against Alabama. It felt like he wasn't really moving at all. And he struggled to get a good push in the running game against Alabama, probably because he isn't that quick. But I'm not going to harp on him too much for not being able to get a push against the really good players at Alabama. However, it is something he's going to need to get better on if he's hoping to become a starter in the NFL. So bottom line, Toth is an experienced and reliable option at the center position. He's probably best going to fit a team that runs a power offense. And he does struggle with athleticism and movement, but he also knows where his limits are, and he's usually in good position when he needs to be. he has the potential to become a starter in a few years, but most mock drafts have him going in the mid to late rounds, rounds 5 to 6. I don't anticipate many centers are going to be taken in this draft, so for whatever reason, if the Steelers feel the need to take one, he may still be available in the final round. So that's the only center prospect I have. So now let's take a look at Corey Levin from the University of Chattanooga, a guard standing at 6'4" and 307 pounds. Despite coming from a small school, Levin was a 3-time All-American at Chattanooga, splitting up 50 starts among left guard, left, and right tackle. Levin made the Southern Conference's all-freshman squad and was voted the best blocker in the conference each of its next 2 seasons, and arguably should have won it this past season as well. It's interesting to note only one other player from Chattanooga has been selected in the first 100 picks in the NFL draft. Levin could be the second player. The only other player to have that happen is Terrell Owens, so that's someone who's bordering on the Hall of Fame, so that's just interesting to note. So some strengths about his game. Levin has a powerful core, giving him a low center of gravity and plays with a low pad level. He has a good quickness off the line and good agility, and is pretty light on his feet, something that Toth was not. He has a mean streak and a willingness to finish his block strong, something that coaches really love, and he's also a pretty good puller. Weaknesses, he's obviously not going to have a lot of good things to say. They're not going to have a lot of good things to say about his strength of competition at Chattanooga. He's too light to be an NFL lineman at this point. He needs to bulk up without losing his speed and agility. He tends to stop moving his feet when he's engaged and will lean into opponents too. This will make him vulnerable to speed rush moves or being pulled off balance. Despite being able to play multiple positions in college, he may actually only be suited for the center position. So bottom line, Levin offers some upside, but his technical struggles are compounded because he didn't play a strong level of competition. He can become a starter someday, but will likely have to do it as a center who doesn't amaze people. Mock drafts have had him going in the 7th round. So if I had to rank these 2 prospects based on how I'd see them, if the Steelers were to pick them, I'd prefer the Steelers take Toth over Levin, and there's not much to say. The Steelers don't need both of them or either of them in that case. But if for some reason they feel the need to bolster the depth there, or there's an injury that, say, BJ Finney is lost for the season, they'll pick up someone in the draft, but there shouldn't be any reason that between now and the draft and 2 weeks from now that there shouldn't be anything like that happening. So if I were to take a look at the depth charts for next year, if I had to predict that, starting at guard, I imagine Ramon Foster and David DeCastro are going to be the starters. BJ Finney is going to be the first man off the bench, and Chris Hubbard will be the next man up. At the center position, my backups are the same. I have BJ Finney being the first man off the bench and Hubbard being the second man. And obviously, Marquise Pouncey, the perennial Pro Bowler, is the starter there. So that's all I have to say regarding the centers and tackles on the interior line. Pretty quick evaluation of the offensive line, but something that we need to get through because you do never know. The Steelers tend to draft one every year, but if they do, I'd still be pretty surprised. So thank you for joining me today. Stronger Than Steel Podcast. If you have any questions about the show, email us at strongerthansteel@gmail.com. Check us out on Twitter, stronger_steel. Facebook, we're at Stronger Than Steel Podcast. We post our episodes on YouTube and SoundCloud, so get a chance to check those out. Well, we're only 2 weeks away from the NFL draft, so it's getting down to it. We have our linebackers episode coming up, so we'll get that to you soon. Outside linebackers, I apologize. We'll have to do still inside linebackers, safeties, and defensive line. So we'll get to that as quick as possible, and then hopefully we're hoping to get one last full mock draft episode in, but time will tell on that. And then I've halted the production of the Steelers' top 10 running plays. I wanted to get through the draft first, but once the draft is over, there won't be much going on, so I'll be able to get that done. So thank you again for joining me, and good night, Steeler Nation.